Hello and welcome back to this damn Palladialistic Crusade. This video will be a review of this year's absolutely breathtaking Warner Archive Blu-ray release of 1962's The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm, the second of the only two narrative three-panel or three-piece or three-strip Cinerama features, whatever you want to call them, along with the legendary How the West Was Won. This is a title that I read about my whole life as being completely unrestorable, unsalvageable. The negatives were in terrible shape with awful water damage and mold problems, along with many other issues that come into play when looking at one of the original three-panel Cinerama features or travelogues. So How the West Was Won was able to be done years ago because the negative was in really good shape, but Brothers Grimm had fared terribly. In fact, it's fared so terribly that there is no DVD release, and the only video version was from the 35mm composite print, which is not the way to see a Cinerama film. Basically, everything is squashed down. They also made 70mm versions that way as well. But anyway, so one of those 35mm prints was scanned and transferred for Laserdisc back in the day. Around the same time, they did the How the West Was Won Laserdisc, because that was really the best they could do at the time. But it's still a very compromised version of seeing these two films. But anyway, that was it for Brothers Grimm, and it's been, a rare out-of-print title. That's been the only disc you can get of it, so it's usually very expensive, which is why I've never got one. I finally got to see it by seeing that master run on TCM, which is what they would do every once in a while. So it's like the few times they would run the long version of It's a Mad, 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 Mad World before the Criterion release and before I got the Laserdisc box set, and or how TCM will occasionally run Raintree County, which again, the only way to get that on disc in the longer version is still the Laserdisc release. But anyway, Brothers Grimm was just one of those titles that you would read about and you would wonder what the original Cinerama presentation was like, but there was no way to really experience that because it was just deemed impossible. It was literally marked impossible back in the 90s when they checked everything over for inventory purposes. So the fact that a restoration was even undertaken, let alone completed, shows you the level at which digital technology has improved our ability to actually deal with damaged negatives and things that were thought, had gone beyond the pale and were unsavable and unusable. So this was a mammoth undertaking. It was something that took many, many, many years to do, and really benefited and was only possible due to the restoration efforts on the previous Cinerama travelogues and How the West Was Won as well, really giving Warner Brothers a benchmark for how to present, three-panel Cinerama. But of course, we're only talking about a select number of features and travelogues because, unfortunately, after these two feature films in 1962, the process was deemed far too cumbersome and expensive to continue making feature films with, and MGM finished off the rest of their deal with Cinerama by eventually just switching over to doing 70mm large format titles and road showing them, but projecting them on the deeply curved Cinerama screen. I guess technically United Artists did that first with It's a Mad, 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 Mad World, but MGM did that with other titles like Grand Prix in 2001: A Space Odyssey and Ice Station Zebra. So those films typically can get referred to as Cinerama, or people saw them in Cinerama, but they are not the traditional three-panel Cinerama experience that first wowed audiences back in 1952 with This Is Cinerama, which is the film that really blew the gates off and started the widescreen revolution, which then everybody tried to jump on that bandwagon as a way to compete with the threat of television that was totally killing their box office and audience numbers, along with many societal changes in the post-war period into the 1950s. So Cinerama has a special place in motion picture history for many reasons, but chiefly among those are the technical presentation was so far beyond what anybody had seen or experienced or even tried to really do on a substantial scale that it was a total game changer, and then inspired every other studio to do their own version that they could do without having to build custom theaters. So that's why you had Fox quickly jump on to CinemaScope and release The Robe practically a year later millimeter in 1953, and then every other studio had to come up with their version, whether they wanted an anamorphic process, or Paramount came up with VistaVision, and then Michael Todd, who was a part of Cinerama originally, splintered off and started his own format that eventually became the legendary Todd AO format. There were many different 70 millimeter format types, and then of course widescreen became the standard for regular conventional 35 millimeter presentation, and then it was up to theaters to decide and exhibitors to upgrade if and where possible, and if they didn't, they would pretty much be out of luck. That's after a few years. So once the widescreen changeover happened, by 1954, 1955, it was pretty much widescreen across the board. The problem is people today don't really understand how important Cinerama was and the extent of how technically complicated it was. So for proper 3-panel Cinerama, that means 3 cameras with fixed 27 millimeter lenses to mimic the human eye and human depth perception, fixed at angles in a camera rig. That means the right camera shoots the left camera shoots the right panel image, and the center, obviously the center image. And then that would be mirrored in the projection. So that means 3 pieces of film, 3 projectors on a perfect axis angled directly at the gigantic 146-degree curved screen. And in order to make the curvature work and not to have light refractions going on, it wasn't an actual screen. They were actual louvers on angles. So if you got really close to the screen, you would actually be able to put your hand through it and look at it and realize that it's these louvered pieces of material that, when combined, form a proper deep curved screen. Unfortunately, because they are 3 pieces of film and 3 projectors, you would have the issue come up of the join lines between the panels. And in the restorations that have been done on the Cinerama features, that's been something they've been able to combat. The original theater presentations in Cinerama, when done properly, and when they hopefully nothing went wrong, because this was an exceptionally complicated process to not only do, but to also pull off, and to then do it on a consistent basis. That wasn't particularly an issue, but it's part of the inherent limitations of trying to do this at that time in developing the process. So usually the join lines are the first thing that everybody likes to point out or sort of make fun of, or say that they look kind of weird. And obviously you can tell there's join lines between the 3 panels. But the degree of immersion is such that, and especially in these restorations that really dial out as much of the convergence issues and inherent distortion in the lenses as possible, the immersion factor really negates a lot of that. And that's why when you look at these films on home video, you don't necessarily get the same experience. It's never going to be exactly the same as in seeing it on a proper deep curved Cinerama screen made out of the louver material, because everything else is a simulation. And when you look at these films flat with all of the 3 panels side by side, you see all of the image, but you can see the inherent distortions in the lenses, because these were films designed to be shown on a deep curve. They were not designed to be shown flat. So if you watch them flat, you will have to understand that the limitations are going to be very obvious, and the quirks of Cinerama are going to be very obvious. But what's amazing about a lot of these modern releases is they give you both the flat warts and all approach, so a letterboxing approach that is a very wide image, because you have 3 panels side by side with very large letterboxing bars, and then a separate disc encoding with what's called a Smilebox presentation. And Smilebox, essentially, by using the letterboxing area, which is why it's called a Smilebox, because it looks like the screen's literally smiling at you with these big, huge teeth and a big grin, it slightly stretches and distorts the very edges of the left and the right side of the frame on the exterior panels. And then, of course, the interior panel of the center panel will be a little bit narrower. But by doing that and working out the mathematical equation, it basically is trying to replicate the Cinerama curve. So it's like you're staring into the 3 panels, which is what it was designed and composed for in the first place. Not everybody's a fan of this. That's why it's really important to have both the letterbox and the Smilebox presentations. But for trying to get the Cinerama experience on disc, I think it's an exceptional methodology. I think it works really well. It may not be perfect, and again, nothing is going to be the exact same experience as watching it on a Cinerama 3-panel screen with the deep curve. But this is pretty much as close as you can get to that, and again, it works remarkably well. We first saw it on the Blu-ray release of How the West Was Won, which is now, it was a very early disc for the format, so it's definitely starting to show its age, and I know that George Feltenstein and others are talking about hopefully maybe redoing it now that Brothers Grimm has turned out so well. But that brings us to the archive release of The Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm. So this is a full-on 2-disc special edition, which is very uncommon for the archive. Beautiful original artwork, but this has extensive special features, again uncommon for the archive, so that makes it even more special. So this is very much in keeping with their more deluxe premium discs that they've been doing, usually 1 or 2 a year every once in a while. So this is like their must-own Curse of Frankenstein release. So this has 2 discs, with disc 1 being the letterbox presentation, as I explained before, and then disc 2 is the Smilebox presentation. Now, I do think the Smilebox version is the way to go, but I very much appreciate that the full flat letterboxing version is presented. For those who are new to Cinerama, or if you've never seen this film before, I do encourage you to go with the Smilebox version because you're going to be getting more of the immersion factor, and you're also not going to have to deal with all of the inherent quirks of Cinerama being laid bare like you do with the flat letterbox version. So just keep that in mind, and again, Smilebox does as good as it can, but it is still only a simulation. Nothing is going to fully recreate the Cinerama experience until you're actually projecting this film onto a deeply curved, recreated Cinerama screen, which actually somebody has done that, and I will get to that in a moment. But anyway, this is a standard, just a standard case with 2 discs, but what is wonderful, and again, very uncommon for archive discs, so that makes it all the more special, is they have made a beautiful little booklet, which is, for the most part, actually recreating the original souvenir program from the film's roadshow release. And of course, both these films were roadshown in Cinerama theaters with the hard ticket and everything. Then you'd have to go to the big cities where there was a Cinerama theater. But there's a piece on George Powell, the producer and co-director of the film. Then you get a lovely section on the story of the Brothers Grimm as it is retold in the film. But what is going to be most impressive and most informative for people is you have the final panel, well, the final page, What is Cinerama, giving you the old salesmanship version of the process. But then the final page is reserved for the restoration info, which is the most important. And then I also love on the back page, they've recreated reused one of the other original posters. But then at the very bottom, they've tucked in the restoration credits, so they're nice and out of the way, and this is a beautiful way to do a restoration poster that doesn't get in the way of the original art and credits. Now, I want to read this restoration paragraph to hopefully give you an idea of just how much work this took. So this new HD Video Master is a totally new representation that captures the essence of the production's original Cinema Roadshow exhibition by combining the 3 Cinerama film panels into a single seamless widescreen image. The 3 6-perforation 35mm camera negatives had suffered extensive shrinkage, warpage, and moisture damage in the MGM vaults over 40 years ago. With the efforts of Warner Motion Picture Imaging and the Cinerama Inc. restorationists David Strohmeyer and Tom March, the film has gone through a modern miracle, and that's no understatement, because this is miraculous of today's digital restoration arts to create this new 4K restoration. And it goes on to say this is the first time that audiences can experience the film as intended, and they are absolutely right. All you have to do is look at how the film has been from the composite 35mm version scanned back in the early 90s, and that's not the way to see this film. The alternate Smilebox version was rendered so the flat images look look as if they're projected. So again, as I said, basically recreating the Cinerama experience as best as possible. So that's just a little blurb that's on the back page, and it also gives the technical credits. But it's a combined team effort of Warner MPI doing the scanning and the Cinerama restoration experts, David Strohmeyer and Tom March, who have worked on How the West Was Won and the other Cinerama travel logs that have been released on Blu-ray from other labels that I've been always wanting to check out. Now I'm just like, why haven't I done it already? But this, I think, is the crowning achievement so far, because this film was thought, just pretty much gone, and to see it this way, it's like seeing it for the first time. I had seen it once before in its entirety in that composite version from the old Video Master, and I really thought it was okay, and it doesn't have the greatest reputation in the world, but seeing it this way, it's a whole other film. It's totally different, and I was just blown away, and I was like, how could this be the same film that I saw on TCM all those years ago, and just remember just being maybe so-so. But also, this was a full from the ground up restoration of the film's 7-channel magnetic sound mix. That's another part of Cinerama that was revolutionary that most people don't realize. They may know about the deeply curved screen and the 3 panels, but Cinerama also had multi-channel stereo audio. 5 channels across the front stage, basically like what became standard in 70mm, and then they had 2 surround channels, which could either be mono or stereo, so 5 across the front, and then 2 in the rear of the hall, creating a surround sound experience. This, again, sort of filtered over into 70mm processes and 4-track magnetic audio for CinemaScope premieres, but it was part of the immersion factor that was so amazing for audiences in the 50s and 60s. And again, all the stuff trickled over into the other format processes, even though Cinerama did not have the legs that they did. But the audio has been restored. It's presented in lossless 5.1 DTS HDMA that does recreate the original experience. And what I found most rewarding is that all of the directional dialogue is still intact. Directional dialogue where the dialogue literally follows the characters back and forth across the screen, because they had 5 channels to play with on the stage, and a lot of older roadshow films would do this. Unfortunately, a lot of this stuff gets mixed out on home video releases or restorations, because the industry standard is to mix all dialogue in the center channel and keep it locked, because a lot of people feel directional dialogue is too distracting and unnatural. But when done correctly, and the way that it was done back in the 50s and 60s, it can be unbelievably impressive, and you forget about it being there because it feels so natural. The 2 Cinerama features do have directional dialogue. I know some people have thought maybe it was mixed out of How the West Was Won, but it's still there. It's not as widespread as some later 70mm roadshows that I've experienced with heavy directional dialogue usage, but it is there, and it was wonderful to hear that in Brothers Grimm. The actual rears are mostly music and ambience, as were most multi-channel or stereo engagement classic roadshow films, so it's not like there's tons of effects going on and lots of discrete usage. It's more about maintaining the ambience in the entirety of the theater hall. They were working, apparently, in the documentary and other things, it said they were working from older transfers of the magnetic masters that Chase Audio did back in the late 90s, I think, and then they were bringing that into the digital realm for restoration work and rendered out this 5.1 lossless track. It sounds wonderful, and Cinerama incorporated new ways of recording sound, because they wouldn't just go out with 3 cameras, they would also go out with multiple microphones in a rig. So sometimes you can look at production stills and see that the sound rig is literally like 7 different microphones in a spread to sort of capture the live sound field, so then they could incorporate that into their 7-channel mix, along with the beautiful studio orchestra recordings of the musical score. So it is a real game changer in the sound world in terms of the history of cinematic sound. Now, in terms of this presentation, I think it sounds incredible, but I did notice there was some intermittent tape hiss and a little bit of noise here and there in the surround channel, primarily the right surround for some reason. So I can only surmise that that must be inherent damage or something that they were trying to tame down a little bit. But it kept throwing me because I kept thinking, I'm like, am I hearing something in the right surround? It's very minor, but it is something I noticed. And if you're an audio geek like me, don't think you're crazy. It is in there. But I noticed everybody else is just talking about, oh, the score sounds great and gives it, a great review, but they don't talk about the directional dialogue, which is thankfully still there. So you will get some of that left to right, back and forth across the front stage channels when you're watching this, which again helps to reincorporate the gigantic theater experience and immersion factor. But I did notice there was a little bit of noise and tape hiss, sort of intermittent, cutting in and out of the right surround. So again, I think that's just trying to work with the elements as they were and trying to overcome as best as possible the years and decades of damage that has happened to this film. And then we come to the picture transfer, which it's the same underlying master made for each version. Then the master is made for the letterbox version and the Smilebox version, and they're presented on two different discs, so they don't compete with each other for bit rate in terms of data space. So they each have their own disc, so they each have a maxed out bit rate. So there's no issues there in terms of the encoding. This master is unbelievable, and I would give anything to see it in 4K on a Cinerama screen with the deep curve projected. It's another Warner Archive title that, if you put it in and somebody saw it on a 4K television, they would perfectly believe it's a UHD. It is that unbelievable. And of course, we're talking about Cinerama in its original 3-panel designation with its large format and its insane amounts of detail, but it is revelatory. It is one of the finest home video presentations I have ever seen, because these films are so incredibly difficult to present, and the fact that you have both the flat letterbox and the Smilebox presentation to choose from. And on top of that, the restoration efforts were actually able to overcome some of the inherent issues in the original Cinerama system. So, like a lot of the other restorations they've done, this is technically a better presentation than what you would have seen on the original run in the 3-panel Cinerama, because you don't have to worry about the interlock going off between the 3 projectors, and you don't have to worry about the same degree of barrel distortion between the 3 panels. And also, they were able to eliminate a lot of the join line problems, which is something that is just mind-blowing. All of this stuff is covered in the must-watch documentary that's included. It's almost feature-length. It's about 45 minutes long, going through the process of restoring this film and just how much work it took. And of course, in the middle of the pandemic as well. So they're having to work out of their houses a lot, and they're having to go shot by shot by shot for each of the 3 panels, and then having to look at original negative materials and 3 color separations, and going to the YCM masters, the 3 color separation protection masters, for each of the 3 panels. So this isn't just like the workload of restoring one film. This is the workload of restoring one film times 3 times 3. And then once you do all that, then you have to bring everything in for the normal restoration efforts, and then you have to recombine them, and then you have to worry about correcting for the inherent distortion of the lenses and all of the inherent quirks of Cinerama. So the workload of this is just on steroids. That there's a reason why it took so long, and I'm amazed they were able to do it as quickly as possible in just 2.5, 3.5 years. And of course, years of research before that, and hoping and thinking and wondering if maybe this might be possible. And of course, it's a very expensive process, because you are dealing with the granddaddy of modern widescreen film formats, with all of its quirks in the original 3-panel system. So if you see this film, you have to watch the documentary feature that is included to understand completely the level of work and care that has gone into producing this. It is unbelievable. And it is capped off by the fact that, as usual, Warner Archive has chosen original artwork for the 2 discs, but chosen two of the gorgeous original painted artworks that were used in the original poster campaign. So you have disc 1 with the flat letterbox version, which again is in a very, very wide ratio. So when you put this in, and if you don't know anything about Cinerama, it's going to look very strange. And then disc 2 is the Smilebox presentation. The extras themselves are split up over the two discs, again, to conserve bitrate space, which is how all disc releases should be. So disc 1 gives you the announcement trailer in terms of the actual, what would be now considered the teaser trailer, and then the theatrical trailer. Both of these are presented in a flat letterbox ratio, just like the main transfer on disc 1. And then these are repeated on disc 2 in the Smilebox form. So you not only get the restored film in both letterbox and Smilebox, but the original trailers as well, which is just wonderful. Then disc 1's extras continue with vintage radio interviews with two of the stars of the film, Russ Tamblyn and Yvette Mimieux, who both were interviewed for the film's premiere. And I always love hearing vintage radio interviews like that, because they're very immediate, and they're little time capsules of the premiere engagements and the press release statements and stuff. And of course, most of that stuff has not survived, so getting to hear little things like that are nice little time capsule treasures tied in directly to the film's original release. And then disc 1 is capped off by two new featurettes. One, the epic art of the Brothers Grimm, which it goes over the incredible poster artwork that was done for the film's ad campaigns. So these are two of the main three, and these are gone over in great detail. There's one of the other ones, with some of them actually showing off the very original painting itself, which is just mind-blowing. And then the other is entitled The Wonderful Career of George Pal, which is a really nice segment on George Pal's work and his legacy in the cinematic medium, not only the films he directed, but the films he produced, also his legendary science fiction and fantasy films, of which Brothers Grimm is pretty much the capstone because of its epic nature. But of course, George Pal is most always now remembered for his 1950s and early 60s classic science fiction fantasy films like The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine, and also for his innovative work with the Puppetoons, which are of course featured in one of the fantasy sequences of this film. Disc 2, of course, is the Smilebox disc. So you get the Smilebox transfer, and in addition, you get the Smilebox versions of both of the original trailers. Then this is where the Rescuing a Fantasy Classic, that's the documentary, again, almost feature length, about the restoration and saving of the wonderful world of the Brothers Grimm. It is so fascinating that you wish it was 2 hours long. It's not. I mean, they cover everything, and in down-to-earth details, so everybody can understand it, with the actual footage of them doing the restoration work, and then they go into MPI, so you get to geek out at seeing the Warner Brothers scanning division at their full glory. But it is one of the best restoration documentaries ever made. No punches are pulled. It's very straightforward, and it shows you just the excruciating amount of detail they had to go into to save this film and restore it, because the workload was unbelievable. So that is a must-watch, and it is the best extra on here. It's the most important one, because people need to understand how difficult this stuff is and how important it is that films like this be saved, because they really are one of a kind. Then there is another little featurette about the plaque that was erected in the actual historical village where they shot the actual narrative part of the film. Then there's another featurette entitled A Salute to William Foreman, which is a nice little piece about the former chairman of Pacific Theaters, who then was one of the co-chairs of the Cinerama Corporation itself. And then to cap it off, there is a really wonderful slideshow of a lot of rare on-set stills and publicity stills for the film. And that is the entirety of the supplemental features package. So again, this is one of Warner Archive's nice knock it out of the park releases that is still priced at the same extremely affordable, around $20 price point. So you're not having to pay an extra premium. You're getting the same quality, but, tenfold for the same low price. So there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to check this film out, because it is worth its weight in gold. Just even if you're not a fan of fantasy films, this is a must-own title simply because it is that astounding. Now, to talk a little bit about the film itself, again, I had only seen this in its entirety once before on the heavily compromised version that was transferred to Laserdisc back in the early 90s, so that is not the way to see it. It doesn't have the greatest reputation in the world. It is the family-friendly fantasy film of the two narrative Cinerama features. How the West Was Won was considered the more adult film, if you will. So they hedged their bets by, of the two films, making sure one could be sold to family audiences. So this takes the story of the famous brothers Grimm, and in collecting their famous tales, the film then transitions into at least 3 fantasy dream sequences, with a smaller one towards the very end of the film, technically being a 4th. This really tries to highlight the capabilities of the Cinerama camera, but the workload was such that George Pal was originally going to direct the entire film, but then wound up only doing the fantasy sequences and then producing the film. So the actual rest of the film, the more standard narrative of the Brothers Grimm themselves, was actually directed by Henry Levin, who was a pretty decent choice to helm this because he had already done the Fox version of Journey to the Center of the Earth. So it doesn't have the greatest reputation in the world, and people think, oh, fantasy film, and they think of family films in the way that they were at this point in time, and they sort of just write it off outside of the technical, fantastic capabilities of Cinerama. But seeing it this way in the restoration, I have to say that it was a real eye-opener, because this film, while it doesn't have, shall we say, the strongest script in the world, and it can technically kind of drag here and there, it has such a heart and such a spirit to it, and the artistry and the technical display, the beauty of the score, the beauty of the locations, the way the Cinerama camera is applied to it, the strength of some of the lead performances. It really it wins you over almost immediately, and it has such a heart to it that is something you find in a lot of the classic George Pal films, that you can't help but not like it. Even though it has a longer runtime of 2 hours and 20 minutes with the intermission and the roadshow overture and interact music, it adds to the experience, and in a lot of ways I do think it's actually a more focused story than the much more sprawling How the West Was Won, which is longer as well. And that does help it a little bit. So if you're used to how roadshow films can be, in terms of the story can be a bit more drawn out because it is a roadshow, it's a different form, this will feel just fine. But I have to say, it's a whole different experience seeing this film this way in the restoration and in both the letterbox and Smilebox presentations. So don't let the fact that it's a family film and it has a lower reputation hold you or keep you from looking at this. Again, this is a must-watch and a must-own simply for the Cinerama experience and the technical presentation and the restoration. But the film itself has such a heart to it that you'll find yourself whistling and humming the music for like the next week. It really gets into your head. It has such an infectious spirit. And in terms of the cast, they all do rather well. But I have to say that Lawrence Harvey pretty much is just a life force in every scene he's in. He's just picking up everything that isn't nailed down with his charisma. So if this film deserved any special acting awards, it would have to be Lawrence Harvey's sheer energy on screen. But it's a far more amazing film than I originally ever gave it credit for, because I only saw it in the very compromised version. And you actually do get to see a clip of that. I guess they scanned one of the old 35mm or 70mm composite prints where all 3 panels are just shoved in with really thick join lines onto a single piece of film. And you can see a clip of that in the documentary. And in fact, it's so fascinating that, to be honest, I wish there was a disc 3, or they had somehow included that version for historical or archival purposes, so people could then see for themselves what the standard version looked like and how the film was stuck for decades. I think that would have been fascinating. Of course, it is rather redundant. You're just looking at that for, you know, just for fun, really. But I think that would have been a fun addition as well for archival purposes, just to see how compromised 3-panel Cinerama would be in the standard release prints made for smaller towns in the next years to come after the Roadshow release, and to see how this film was badly treated, and just to see how bad it looked when it was so bad off after damage and then the compromised single film prints. So again, I am just... This was a title nobody ever thought would happen. This was a title, it didn't even get a DVD release. That's how bad off it was. So your only bet was to see it on the rare TCM screenings, which were a version of the Laserdisc Master. So you had to go out and plunk down a big chunk of change to get the Laserdisc, which was a good presentation of the heavily compromised version. So this is a miraculous restoration. I encourage everyone who loves, if you love films, if you love the technical side of films, if you love films with great heart, if you love films of the Roadshow period that were made with such artistry and on such grand scales and had such a showmanship to them that has never been equaled ever after, this is a must. And the fact that this is a $20 release, actually I think it's less than that right now, because most Warner Archive discs sort of fluctuate in price. If this was, you know, $40 or $50, it would still be worth every penny. It is unbelievable. This is one of those discs that I think everybody who has a Blu-ray player should own a copy of. This is a demo disc, if there ever was one, to show things off, because Cinerama is such a mind-blowing thing when you see it and experience it for the first time, especially in the proper 3-panel presentations. And again, the restoration work on this is unbelievable. And again, it is so good that everybody's talking about, you know, can we go back and rework How the West Was Won? Because this is a very old Blu-ray now. It's in the VC1 codec, you know, it's got the old Warner menu style, and unfortunately the Smilebox disc is out of print. So it would be amazing if Warner Archive decided to go back, redo How the West Was Won, because the negative's in really great shape, and use the new digital tools that weren't available then, that they were able to use for Brothers Grimm. So it's possible we could get How the West Was Won looking just as good, if not even better, than Brothers Grimm, because it doesn't have the inherent problems in its negative. So hopefully sales of this are very strong to encourage more very difficult restorations, and perhaps encourage a version 2 of the restoration of How the West Was Won, because that would be amazing to get a disc of that. And the old Blu-ray still holds up very well, don't get me wrong, but it is an older Blu-ray, so I can only imagine what the new tools will look like applied to How the West Was Won, as they have done with Wonderful World of the Brothers Grimm. So this is a strong contender for disc of the year. I am so very tempted to just go ahead and call it, because this is just unbelievable. I mean, again, I could only read about this film for years because I was such a geek as a kid. I was already reading film books and looking at, oh, wow, that's the other Cinerama film, but it's, you know, beyond lost because of damage. Yeah, the only thing I can see coming close to this is the 4K restoration of Invaders from Mars, because that film has been in rights hell for decades. People have been trying to save it since the 70s at least. But even that did not require the amount of work that this film did, which in terms of its elements was thought beyond saving. So again, I am so very tempted to just go ahead and call it the disc of the year for 2022. It is that important. The restoration work is that stunning. In fact, I wish this could get a 4K release as well to even better show off the restoration work. But again, the Blu-ray is so outstanding that most people will mistake this for a 4K disc if you were watching it on a 4K television. It is unbelievable. And the fact that it is still at the standard Warner Archive, very affordable price point, please, whatever you do, if you have a Blu-ray player, get a copy of this. You will not regret it. Even if you find the film a little bit slow or it's not necessarily your thing, the restoration efforts and the impact of proper 3-panel Cinerama with the original 7-channel magnetic stereo audio, there's nothing else like it, and it's astounding that, you know, they put all this work into it, and unfortunately only 2 narrative Cinerama features were ever made. So that makes these films even more special, and that is why I think this is one of the most important Blu-rays, not just this year, not just this decade, but ever. This is a home video dream for a lot of people, because this is a title that we all thought would just never be restored. The cost would be too astronomical, it would be too difficult, or it was just physically impossible because the elements were so far gone. So I hope I've conveyed enough of this stuff, because this was such an eye-opener coming back to this film after all these years. And again, seeing it in the compromised versions, it is not the same. The 2 narrative Cinerama features hold a special place in the cinematic history of the entirety of the medium, and they are truly one of a kind. Please do yourself a favor. Get a copy of this. Check it out for yourself. You will not regret it. Again, I think this is one of the finest Blu-rays ever produced. I do not say that lightly. Warner Archive has done it again with one of their really premier deluxe editions. This goes on the shelf right next to their Curse of Frankenstein special edition as one of the finest Blu-rays ever produced. So that's it for this review. I hope I have conveyed enough of the importance of how amazing this restoration and this Blu-ray presentation is. Again, I think it is absolutely essential, and if you've never seen this film before, and if you've never seen Cinerama, it will blow your mind. With the inherent limitations and quirks of Cinerama notwithstanding. And it's so fascinating seeing these films in the home looking like this, and being able to check out the Smilebox simulation as well. So for those who have already gotten Brothers Grimm, I would love to hear your thoughts on the Warner Archive Blu-ray release in the comments section, or if you're interested in picking it up, because you know, Warner Archive always has amazing gems coming out every month, but this one is truly special. So I was going to say highly encourage, but I must say I stress, please get a copy of this and support astonishing restorations like this for films that have been deemed for decades just totally gone and unsalvageable. So again, quite possibly disc of the year. I won't say that 100% because, of course, we're not even done with 2022 yet, but that's the importance and the amazing impression that this disc and this film will leave on you in its restoration. So as always, I'd like to say, you know, keep supporting studios and boutique labels by buying disc releases, and keep physical media alive. And thanks ever so much for watching.